My presentation will be on the current state of deployment of the resource public key infrastructure, of the RPKI. And let's start with a few fundamentals on BGP and the RPKI. So the BGP is the routing protocol of the internet. And it was developed in a time that was perhaps much simpler because then security wasn't a big concern in the development of internet protocols. And so BGP builds on the inherent trust between systems. This means that in BGP, any system can announce to own any prefix, and then other systems will believe this announcement and start to route traffic that has a destination inside this prefix to the system that announced it. And this can, of course, become a problem when you have malicious systems announcing prefixes they do not own, because this enables the systems to hijack IP traffic, because other systems believe the announcement and then send IP traffic to them, which shouldn't go to them. And to prevent this problem of hijacks, the resource public key infrastructure was standardized. And the RPKI basically consists of a system of distributed repositories where ASs can upload authorization objects that contain a list of ASs that are authorized to announce their prefix. So they usually authorize themselves, obviously, and then they can also authorize other systems. And then routers can go to the RPKI and download these objects and validate them, and then check announcements that they receive against the RPKI to check if they are hijacks. And if they are, they will drop the announcements and the hijack can't spread. And in the context of RPKI, this is referred to as route origin validation, or ROV. And measuring ROV deployment is not straightforward because systems have complex routing policies and they change their routing behavior all the time. So pinpointing if a certain routing change and the drop of a certain packet was caused by ROV or by other mechanisms is not easy. And there are two projects currently that attempt to measure the deployment of RPKI, which are by Cloudflare and by ATHENE. And they use different methodologies, but both of them find that approximately 30% of systems enforce ROV, so they use the RPKI to filter BGP announcements. And there has also been scientific work on this. The last study was done 2021, and they found that only 0.6% of ASs enforce ROV. So you see there's a big discrepancy there. And so at the start of our project, we checked all of these approaches and we identified that they are sometimes inefficient, they have false positives, false negatives, and so on, which motivated us to develop a new methodology to measure ROV, which is trying to reduce the false positive rate and also trying to be as efficient as possible. So now let's talk about how to efficiently measure ROV. And the next part will be a bit reduced from the paper, so if you want to see the full methodology, feel free to refer to the paper. And the basic idea of our methodology is to compare the different propagations of valid announcements versus hijacks. And for this, we have two ASs in the internet. Here in the example, we call them T1 and T2. And both of these ASs announce two prefixes, prefix 1 and prefix 2, to the internet all the time. And then we use the RPKI to only authorize one AS for each of the prefixes, which means that in this case, in the example, T2 attempts to hijack prefix 1, and T1 attempts to hijack prefix 2. And then we look at the propagation of these announcements, and we see that for prefix 2, actually the hijack is spreading, and the ASs 1, 2, 3, and 4, they believe the hijack and start to route traffic that has a destination in prefix 2 to T1, which means the hijack is successful. And by checking the paths in the internet, we can identify that all of these ASs do not enforce ROV because they didn't check that the announcement is valid. And the situation changes when we now have an AS that enforces ROV. So AS4 in this case now is enforcing ROV, which enables the AS in both cases to identify which of the announcements is a hijack. And so it will drop the hijack and instead forward the valid announcement. And now in this case, all of the systems, AS1, 2, 3, and 4, will adapt their routing and they will only send traffic to the valid target. And this allows us to infer that the systems somehow learned about the validity of the objects and adapted their routing accordingly. But because all of the systems changed their routing, it's not easy for us to infer which of the systems was enforcing ROV, because potentially they might be collaterally protected, and so they did adapt their routing even though they don't enforce ROV themselves. And what we observed was that you can actually identify which AS is the likely point that enforced ROV, because in this case, AS4 is the point where the paths to the two prefixes diverge. So AS4 is the system that actively adapted its routing to the validity of the objects in the RPKI, and therefore we can say that the most likely point of our reinforcement was AS4, and in our methodology, we call this metric the divergence point. And with our methodology, we now come to our measurement results. So for the presentation, I simplified this a bit and summarized the categories into 3 different types. And categories 1 to 3 are ASs that we observed that fell victim to our hijacks, so they are likely not enforcing ROV strictly. And actually, the majority of these ASs don't show any signs of our reinforcement. But we also saw some systems in the internet that show signs of our reinforcement, but the enforcement is not comprehensive. For example, because some of the routers in the systems don't yet enforce ROV, so in some cases they did fall victim to our hijacks. Then we have category 4 and 5. These are systems which did not fall victim to our hijacks, but they did, but we couldn't find any clear signs of our reinforcement, which means that these systems are likely passively protected. So for example, all of their upstream providers use the RPKI and therefore filter for prefix hijacks, which protects these systems even though they don't have their own enforcement. And then we have categories 6 and 7, and these are systems which do enforce ROV. We saw clear evidence of them enforcing ROV, and these systems made up 24% of the ASs that we observed in our measurement. And we also looked at this in more detail. We looked at, does the rate of ROV enforcement differ between different types of ASs? And if, in fact, we observed that the rate of ROV enforcement is correlated with the business type of the systems. So the more a system is focused on routing and the more a system is paid to forward traffic, the higher is the average rate of ROV enforcement. So we saw the highest rate of enforcement in the tier 1 providers, whereas the lowest rate of enforcement was in the stub ASs, so ASs that are not paid to forward traffic. And a notable exception of this observation were the internet exchange points, because for the IXPs, our classification scheme classified the majority of them, the large majority in fact, as not strictly enforcing ROV. And this surprised us because we know that over recent years, more and more IXPs have started to pick up ROV and have started to filter BGP announcements. And so to understand why we made this observation, we must understand how IXPs work. And at IXPs, you basically have 2 different options for peering with other systems. You can either use the historic version, which is direct peering, and at direct peering, the IXP provides the hardware, and systems use these hardware to directly peer with each other. So they directly exchange BGP announcements with each other, and the IXP doesn't really have control over these BGP sessions because the sessions are made directly between the systems, and the IXP is basically just providing the level 2, level 3 hardware for it. And the second option are the IXP route servers. And route servers are a quite new technology, and the route servers simplify establishing peering sessions at the IXPs. Because now the systems at the IXP don't have to manually create contracts and connections to all systems they want to peer with. Instead, they can peer just with the route server, and the route server will have other peering partners and will forward announcements it receives to all other connected systems. And in the context of RPKI, the main advantage of the route servers is that now the IXP has control over the BGP sessions because all the systems have a BGP session with the route server. And this allows the route server to filter all announcements it receives against the RPKI. And therefore, the route server can actually enforce ROV. So when the route server receives an announcement by a system which contradicts the RPKI, it is able to drop the announcement and therefore stop the spread of the hijack. So to summarize, at the IXPs, the IXP can only enforce ROV in the route servers and not in the direct peering sessions. And this, of course, motivates the question, how prevalent are these direct peering sessions at the IXP? And what we observed in our measurements was that these peering sessions are still very prevalent. So for all large IXPs, we saw that up to 50% of the paths that we observed in our measurements actually were learned over direct peering sessions. And this then explains our observation that a lot of IXPs were classified as not strictly enforcing ROV because the IXPs were propagating these hijacks over the direct sessions, and therefore our classification saw that a lot of hijacks went over the IXPs, and therefore it classified them as not strictly enforcing ROV. And this observation motivated us to also try to quantify the impact that ROV has on the spread of hijacks, both in general systems that we observed and also in the IXPs. And for this, we created 3 different graphs. We had created one graph, just a general internet graph. Then we have one graph which takes into account all ROV that we observed, and one graph which just takes IXP ROV into account. And for time's sake, we want to look at only 2 parameters. And the first parameter we want to look at is how does ROV impact graph connectivity for hijacks. And what we observed was that both ROV in general and ROV in route servers significantly reduces the connectivity available to prefix hijacks. So ROV manages to make the spread of hijacks much more difficult because the hijacks have much less paths available to them. And the second parameter we want to look at is the maximum path length. So how far on average how many hops can a BGP prefix hijack reach? And we see that for general systems, so if you look at all the systems in the internet, with the ROV that we observed, the longest path length is significantly reduced. So on average, the hijacks cannot reach as far. So if you want to run an attack, you have to be quite close to your victim. And the interesting observation was that the IXP ROV doesn't significantly reduce the longest path length. And if you think about it, it actually makes sense because the hijacks are still able to spread over the IXPs through the direct sessions. So the IXP is able to connect the systems connected to it locally, but it has a hard time to prevent the spread of the hijacks globally because they can spread through the direct sessions. And with this, let's come to a conclusion. So the first observation of our research was that the rate of ROV enforcement differs significantly by AS type. And the rate is actually aligned with the business incentive of the systems. Then the second observation was that ROV already provides a measurable protection to the internet, and hijacks today have a much harder time to spread than they had maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And the last observation is that the direct peering sessions at the IXP limit the impact that IXPs can have on the global spread of hijacks. And at this point, I want to emphasize that we do think IXP route servers play a very important role in protecting the internet because they enable the local protection of connected systems. But because of the direct sessions, they have a hard time to protecting the global internet, like the fast spread of the hijacks. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And if you have any questions later, feel free to drop me an email. Thank you.